Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Classical Wisdoms webinar on the Jews in the Roman Bathhouse. This is going to be a really interesting one. I'm very excited about this. I've been enjoying reading up on it and preparing for it, as well as even visiting archaeological sites with bathhouses. It's been tough. It's been tough, and even going to bathhouses myself. So I would like to introduce to everybody Yaron Eliav. He is the Associate Professor of Rabbinic Literature and Jewish History of Late Antiquity at the University of Michigan, and he's the author of God's Mountain, the Temple Mount in Time, Place, and Memory, and the producer of the documentary Paul and Athens, and most recently his book, A Jew in the Roman Bathhouse, A Cultural Interaction in the Ancient Mediterranean, which has been extremely interesting, and it's been fascinating to see. We see these archaeological sites, these towering baths, throughout the ancient world, and they're these huge sites, and yet we rarely comprehend just how important they were, how people interacted in them, how they lived in them and spent time in them. So I'm really pleased that Yaron can illuminate us all. So with that, I will welcome you, Yaron, to the stage. He's going to give us a bit of an introduction on the bathhouse. We're going to talk about it a bit more, and then we're going to welcome questions from the audience. And so with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anya. A double thanks first for coming up with this idea and inviting me to talk in front of this forum that you have here and organizing the whole thing. But also thank you for pronouncing my name properly. Going all over the world, Yaron is not the most common name, and I get a whole variety of those. Yaron actually in ancient Hebrew means joy, and I always say it's the misconception my parents had about me when I was born. They saw me and they said, "Oh, so much joy," and I just proved them wrong ever since. And my mom actually is supposed to be among the people who is watching here. I can't find her. I was looking, and I prefer not to see her because I get nervous when she's around. But yeah, I'm this to say that I'm really happy to be with you and get the opportunity to talk to you about my work and about this book and about this topic, and to try to sell to you not the book itself, but the idea of why it's significant to study these kind of issues, which kind of deviate from the norm, the main path of Roman history, where you study wars and empire and even social history. And here it's kind of one institution and what's involved in all that. I hope that by the end of the discussion today, this would be much clearer. So with no further ado, you don't need to see me on the screen. What I'll do, if possible, I'll just I prepared a short PowerPoint for you just to kind of bring you into the bathhouse. I wrote a large book, and you're all welcome to read it if you want. But just to get a feel, you all heard of bathhouses. The word explains itself, and you've seen Roman bathhouses. These are people who are interested in the ancient world here. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the 15-20 minutes that I have, and I'll take you with me. I'm sure you've never been yourself in a real bathhouse as a Roman, not as a tourist, as someone who's watching the History Channel, but go into the bathhouse and experience what it meant to be in a bathhouse. I'll use my time for that. Then we can discuss, the Jews and the Christians and all the other big topics associated with that. And I'll do it with my PowerPoint. Electronics allows us today. I'm going to transform all of you into the Roman world, take you with me into a Roman bathhouse. And this particular bathhouse was built by your humble servant. Let's take a look. Let's see if I can share my PowerPoint. I have big words, but if I'm unable to share the PowerPoint, wait a second, let's go back. So what I need to do is I need to share my screen, right? Here we go. I'm going to share my screen with you. We'll all pray that it's work. Is it working? Anya, give me like a finger. Are you
Yes,
the
you are
screen? You are.
doing brilliantly. We're
All
all
right.
go ahead.
Let's do it this way. So we start, with a self-promotion. Here's the book right in front of you. A Jew in the Roman Bathhouse is on for 10 years. It was just recently published 2 weeks ago. I mentioned my early book. I remember in my early years when I published my first book, and then the second, I would come in front of these crowds. It would never be on Zoom. We would travel the country. I always stand very humble and almost begging, people. I told them, I'm not worthy for you to read my book. I know I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have kids to feed, bread to put on the table. If you can spare some change, or something of that sort. And I would ask them. Then I got tenure and I couldn't care less anymore, So I have my salary, I have my position. I love writing and researching. The book is there. If you want to purchase it, it's great. If you want to leave a note and engage in the conversation, I'd appreciate it and would love it. But, I'm not going to summarize the entire book. There are 350 pages and it's a 10 years work. But let's jump into a bathhouse. So welcome to my bathhouse. Here it is right there in front of you. This is a bathhouse, and this is a picture that's taken from the book. This is an imaginative bathhouse that I created together with an architect and an artist, a Greek architect that I worked with, and it's in the book. And what you have here is a reconstruction of a typical bathhouse. This is not one specific bathhouse that I found somewhere and archaeologists excavated, but it's a combination of all the bathhouses that I know, that I visited, and that I studied in literature, in writing, in archaeological evidence, and so forth. And I recreated together with this architect. We worked on it for almost 2 years. And every detail in this picture, including the colors, everything in the picture is based on some evidence that I found. And it's all documented in the book, and you have all the notes and you can check the references. This is what a typical bathhouse, when we talk about a Roman bathhouse, this is what it would. Some color here with me. So you would walk into the bathhouse from here. This is the entrance. This is the main street that you're on of a city or a village and whatnot. And you'd come, you see the entrances to bathhouses were not monumental. They were very relatively humble, sometimes with 2 small columns and entryway. And you'd walk into this room called the apoditerium right here. It's a changing room. The first thing that you do when you come into a bathhouse, probably the only place in the world, you take your clothes off. What can you do? It's a place to bathe, but as you can see, only half of the place, if you take a typical bathhouse, about half of the bathhouse is an open space, what we call the palestra and whatnot. Only this left half, this area right here, is the one that is under a roof and is closed and is devoted to bathing. So the first thing I guess I say when you come into my bathhouse, hey, welcome, of course. But after that, if we need to understand it, I would say a bathhouse is not a building. It's an architectural complex. That's what we have here. It's an architectural complex that provides a variety of services to people who come in. One of them is water, and we're going to talk about that. Water is very dominating in the bathhouse. You have water pool here and here and here and here. There's water all around the bathhouse, and that's related to the bathing experience. But there's much more going on in the bathhouse, in any typical bathhouse, than just bathing. You see in the palestra, which is not, you see there's no floor, it's covered with sand, and you see these people are in all sorts of physical activities. Some of them, like these 2, are wrestling, a very common sport in ancient times. Other are running, playing ball games and whatnot. As I said, every human being, every person, every detail in this diagram is actually documented in sources and based on my research. So people would do that. I guess the best parallel that we can come, if we want to equate a bathhouse with something that we know, I would call it's even more than a gym. I would call it maybe a country club. right? It's a place that people go to engage in a variety of activities. See, there's food. Here we have the taberna, one here, one here. There's stalls that sell stuff right here. There's there's all around people. You see, here's another one right here, all around. People can buy and sell stuff. They can provide services. If you look carefully, there are other people who provide their services. You see this guy right here. I'm not going to talk about, there are all sorts of services that are provided, sort of like a country club, with one difference. And this is to ask you, how many of you been to a country club in the last week? Maybe some of you have. I have not. I am a member in some sort of a country club here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I saw every few weeks. Here's one of the major differences. In the Roman world, based on evidence, most people in the Roman world attended the bathhouse with their family and household. Household, I mean, if they have slaves. About a third of the people in the Roman world owned slaves. Another third were the slaves themselves. Another third were not slaves. But everyone would attend the bathhouse on a daily basis. How many times you went to the country club day after day, day after day? On a daily basis, usually in the afternoon, but not only in the afternoon, everyone in the Roman world, they would stop their work. You know, they'd start working in daylight, but they would end their work in the early hours in the afternoon, and they would go in droves to the bathhouse day after day. That already needs to signal that something is happening here. You know, in the Roman world, we're talking about, the estimates are, say, 50 million people live, you know, in what we call the Roman world, you know, all those areas around the Mediterranean, North Africa, Southern Europe, Spain, the Middle East, all those areas, about 50 million people live there. Those are the good estimates. And most of them, and I try to calculate, when you say most, how many? So even if only half of the people went to the bathhouse every day, that's 25 million people attending this institution every day. But it was more than 25. I think it was around 65, 70%. If you get a feel from the sources and you get a feel from the amount of bathhouses that were found to accommodate all those people, that's the amount. And this puts the bathhouse as the most attended institution, or any building for that matter, in the entire Roman world, in entire Roman history, 700 years of history. This is the place that people went to more than any other place. You know, a lot of people went to the market. If you were a merchant, you went, you know, if you want to buy, but not everyone went to the market. Not everyone went to temples. If you were a devotee of a certain god, or what God of Israel, you went to a synagogue, a Christian, you went to a church. Depends what time, what era. If you could go to the temple of Serapis or the imperial temples, but you wouldn't go on a daily basis, and not everyone went there. Same thing with other entertainment institutions. You know, the Romans loved entertainment. There were theaters, there were hippodromes where they had chariot races and whatnot, but those were very expensive. First of all, they weren't everywhere. You know, to build a theater, just like good cities would build them. Bathhouses were in cities and villages. In even the smallest of villages, what the Romans called a vicus, there was sometimes at least one, sometimes even two bathhouses. In the city of Rome, by the way, we have a document called the Notitia Regionum Urbis, which is a document that documents all the buildings in Rome that kind of survived the Middle Ages, and we have it. And you know, in certain times in the city of Rome alone, there were nearly 900 bathhouses, functioning bathhouses in one city. Yes, it's a city of 1 million. Same time, you get a sense of the magnitude and the proliferation of this place. And the question is why? I'll leave that question for a second, but that's what you need to get. Bathhouses are everywhere, in cities and villages, in the smallest of places, a place that accommodates, you know, 400, 500 people living in a small agricultural village, they would build a bathhouse. So that's the first thing I want to mention. Now, what is in a bathhouse? First of all, there's water. And the water, you know, we take water for granted today because everyone has a faucet at home, you know, and we have water running, and it's part of our culture by definition that we have running clean water. But this wasn't like that. And the Romans are known for many things. You know, they're known for their army, for their empire, for their administration, for their law, for their architecture, for all sorts of things. But in the book, I devote an entire chapter to what I call the water revolution of the Romans. The Romans created a revolution in the sense of making water accessible. The accessibility of water was not common before the Romans. I mean, there were rivers, there were springs, people needed water to live, but to have water in tremendous amount of quantities in the cities, available to all people, the Romans were the first to do that. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. I wrote a small chapter about this in the book that had to do with some engineering innovations that they've created, especially the aqueducts, which we all know, which is the tool to bring water from afar. Now, they didn't do that to accommodate bathhouses. They did that because they needed water for their big cities. First in Rome, you know, Rome grew, the city, and there wasn't enough water. So the Romans were very practical. They were always coming up with solutions. They started building these great aqueducts using the arch and using materials that were susceptible to water and not to allow water to kind of sip away. And they created 8, 9 aqueducts, and aqueducts started spreading throughout the Roman world everywhere. In sometimes even in small towns, there's an aqueduct everywhere around the Roman world, and we see some of those we can still see today. But the important thing is that with the aqueducts, Rome, the empire, created access of water and created a surplus of water. There was too much water. The problem with an aqueduct, once you create it, the water doesn't stop. You see that today. We can monitor how much water we take into the house. Aqueducts bring water, and it can never stop. You can create water reservoirs to hold the water, and they did all that. But water was coming in, and in the first century, you know, after all these aqueducts were developed in the century and a half before, cities had too much water, and they started thinking about how to use the water. You know, fountains, gardens came up. Bathhouses were a product of that. What do we do with too much water? Let's create it. So that's one thing. And this I always tell my students, if you want to understand this innovation, just try for a week going cold in your showers. Don't use hot water. And you see, water is great, but when it's cold, even in the summer, it's not the most enjoyable thing to do. Some people like it, but they're relatively few. Rome, a second thing that you see in the bathhouse, and this is this area right here, is the heating system. Roman engineers developed a relatively innovative, ingenious system to be able to heat large quantities of water, but not only to heat them, but to keep them warm. Those are two things that come together. Heating, you know, people can always put some water on fire and they would heat it, but it was never in large quantities. And, you know, there were bathing institutions before the Roman bathhouse, like the Greeks in the gymnasium. 200-300 years before the Romans had these bathing facilities. But what they would have a bathtub. Someone would sit in a tub and they would pour hot water on them, or water that was mixed, that was heated, you know, on a fire or something of that sort. Not in a bathhouse. We're talking about a heating system. This heating system is called in Greek a hypokaust. Kauste in Greek is the verb to heat. Hupo is from underneath. Heating from underneath is the system that you see here. You see it's actually outside the walls of the bathhouse. You come within these steps. Oh, sorry about that. Go back. You come down with these steps right from here, and they're slaves usually that belong to the owner of the bathhouse, or to the city. If it was a bathhouse that was owned by the city, about half the bathhouses were owned by the cities themselves, by the people of the city. And you see there's wood, and there is a furnace here. There's water that comes to this area, these pools right here. This comes from the aqueduct or from other water source that they have in the city. And then what they have is they have the furnace which is heating here. You have these big tubes of water that would be full, and you see it would heat the water here, and then through pipes it would send the water into these pools. hot burning water, some mixed with cool in the tepidarium, which was kind of half and half. But then what do you do? How do you keep the water hot? So the furnace would also send the heat, into these, to underneath the floors. This is an ingenious system. That's why it's called heating from underneath. And you see this room right here it has these pillars, small pillars that you put in, and you raise the floor. The floor is put on the pillars. You see, I cut the floor here. You see it also in this area right here underneath the heated room, the caldarium, and all the room is sitting on these pillars, and hot air from the furnace is pushed into those, and then the hot air circulates under that room. In order for it not to blow up, there are these channels inside the walls that take and it comes out, but there's constant circulation of hot air, and that keeps the floors are burning hot. And that's why if you take a look at these people, it's a little hard to see, but if you take a look at their you take a look at their legs, they're all walking with wooden sandals, specific sandals that they take to the bathhouse, because these floors are very hot and they keep the water hot. And you see the pools, which are hot pools, have these steps that you sit on, so you don't have to sit on the floor itself, because you're going to burn your behind, mind my French. So that's what they would do. And in general, heat and water are the nucleus of a bathhouse. If you go into a bathhouse, around that, a lot of other things continue to develop. The people wanted to come to this place every day. No one forced them. And if you ask why, there's one word answer here: pleasure. In an ancient world that was devoid of many of the pleasures that we have today, no internet, no air conditioning, no many other things that we take for granted, the bathhouses represented the ultimate place where people of all levels could attain to some pleasure in their day, coming after a long day in the market or in the fields or whatever it is that you do. Shed your clothes off and dip in these hot waters. Put some olive oil on your body to clean the body, or maybe then get a massage if you're able to afford it. Buy some food in the taberna, meet people, develop a sweat before that. You have a swimming pool with cold water on the outside. This represented to the Romans, and this is based on sources, numerous sources of different kinds, Jews, not Jews, Romans, everywhere in the Roman world. This is the ultimate pleasure. And people wanted that pleasure. And they expected their cities to provide it to them, and everyone wanted part of it, especially because it was relatively easy to make. You needed a water source. It's not so hard to build a bathhouse. Some of them could be smaller. This is sort of like a mid-size bathhouses. The big bathhouses, let me show you a picture. You probably all know this is the Bath of Caracalla in Rome, a bathhouse that could accommodate nearly 2,000 people at one time. You see, let me show you, here's a reconstruction of the baths of Caracalla. You see, with gardens and water pools and a series of monumental buildings. This was built by the empire. These are the great imperial baths. This was even the largest one. Some years later, the Emperor Diocletian built a bathhouse that was twice as large as this. Today it's the National Museum of Rome, that the remnants of that bathhouse, so you can still see it. But you can go and see the Bath of Caracalla in Rome. So these are imperial, huge bathhouses that can accommodate thousands of people. Smaller bathhouses could accommodate a few hundreds, and there were even smaller that could accommodate only 10, 20, 30 people at a time in the small villages. But everyone wanted part of this. Which brings me to my next topic, my final topic of this introduction. I would say, with the bathhouses being the number one, it is only natural that over the years, the place was imbued with the various features of what we would call Roman culture. The Romans called it Romanitas. That's a term that they used to present their way of life. And it's a very elusive term. What is included in Roman culture? What is Romanitas? It's a lot of things. You know, it's ideology, it's law, it's norms of life, it's aesthetics, it's various concepts about the body and about engineering and about science and about magic and about health and all sorts of things that together they're clustered to represent the Roman way of life. And this is what I argue in the book. The Roman bathhouse is the #1 manifestation of Romanitas that was accessible to everyone, that everyone, if you wanted people to engage with the Roman way of life, it was in the bathhouse more than anywhere else, just because there's so many features. Take a look, bathhouses were decorated, for example, take statues, which are in one of my other topics that I studied over the years. Roman statuary sculpture are representative. Romans were crazy about their statues. They would put so much amount. And look how many statues, in bathhouses, here are statues everywhere. Statues, bathhouses. And this is a simple bathhouse. This is not the imperial bathhouse. In the bath of Caracalla, the person who studied this, the scholar who studied it claimed that there were over 5,000 statues at a certain time when the bathhouse was open. But in this normal bathhouse, 50, 60 statues were right there. And statues represent something. These are not just, like we see them in museums. First of all, they're colored. Second, they're representing the Roman world, the gods, the heroes, the emperors, the dignitaries in the street. There's a whole thing. And statues, a bathhouse is sort of a museum, right? They didn't call it a museum and they didn't function as a museum of Roman statuary, but not only Roman statuary. Features, say, for example, take something from a different realm altogether, Roman attitude to the body, the aesthetics of the body, which is very different from our conceptuality of the body. Romans and Greeks, they took that from the Greeks. They loved their body. They cherished their body. They thought their body was pretty beautiful. And they never felt shy or modest, as we would call it today, to conceal their body. Bodies were on full display in many places in the Roman world. It's very hard for modernists to accept that and to come to terms with that. We're very much influenced by Christianity, medieval Christianity, influenced by Judaism, that created this concept of shame associated with the body. We have to keep it kind of hiding. But the Roman body was full on display. Men and women went to the bathhouse together. Most of them, if you take a look are simply nude, and not because they made a big thing of the nude. Nudity was very common in bathhouses. But in terms of, that's one of the essence of the Roman way of life. We have food in the bathhouse. We have engineering in the bathhouse. We have a whole bunch of other things that I discuss in the book. For example, things that are not part of our life today, like magic. Magic was extremely common in the bathhouse. What is magic? Why do people use magic? Too much for us today, especially there's chapter 8 in the book is all about magic. You can go ahead and read, but I would say in one sentence, magic is sort of the equivalent in our world to what we would call popular science. We have a headache. We go to the pharmacy, take something over the counter. Do we know if it really helps or doesn't help or whatever? But we believe in popular science. They didn't have popular science in the ancient world. They believed in magic. Magic was providing them certain protection, but it was part of the essence of Roman life. Everyone used magic. And magic is here, and numerous other things that I even haven't spoken about, all encapsulated in the bathhouse. So we have a variety of layers. We have the layer of engineering, the water, the heat. We have the people coming together, and that's a lot of the social dynamics, which I didn't even talk about, but that's an entire chapter in the book as well. And we have pleasure and we have culture, multi-layers all coming together in this particular institution, which led me, when I understood this years back, and I said, my own interest is to try to understand cultural dynamics and encounters, how, in my case, I study the Jews in the Roman world. How would the Jews and then Christians engage Roman culture? I said, wow, the bathhouse could be the greatest laboratory for the modern scholar to study these dynamics. If Jews are documented in the sources, and once I started looking, I saw there's a tremendous amount of documentation in Jewish sources about bathhouses. it's very interesting. And from the High Roman Empire, where we have the vast amount of Jewish material, Jews are documented more in bathhouses than in synagogues, just by sheer numbers. If you collect all the sources that talk about Jews in synagogues, I was kind of amazed at first. I didn't want to tell my rabbi or whoever, but it's and not by a few numbers. There's about 3 times more references to bathhouses in what we call rabbinic literature, and we can talk about these texts later, maybe in the discussion, than to synagogues. Wow. But then what did they say? What are the dynamics? That's what I devote the book to start and study how this group, which was probably the largest minority in the Roman world, Roman world, about 50 million people. Out of those 50 million, about 5 million were Jews. Every 10th person in the Roman world, that's people are not aware of those numbers. How did that minority that had such an impact on Christianity and then on Western civilization and whatnot, how did they engage in this period with not bathhouses, but bathhouses as representative of? That's what the book is about, and we can maybe discuss this. And with that, I'll just stop here. I gave you a short introduction. I don't want to take more of the time. I think I already went over the time by a few minutes, and I appreciate you being generous with me about that. A short tour to Eliav's bathhouse, and we can continue pursuing any topic in the discussion. So, Anya, the floor is yours.
Well,
And I see some great questions in the chat, by the way. I'm happy to address those as well, but you take the lead and tell us where we go from here.
Well, I think we have so many questions coming up, but I would love to address a little bit, the second element, because it's the Jew in the bathhouse. So we've got the bathhouse. And I think it would be really interesting to sort of set the floor a little bit with what the Jewish society was like at that time, and how did this large minority sort of exist within the Roman Empire?
Absolutely. Fascinating topic. That's my life pursuit. I devoted my professional life to study the Jews in ancient times. So that's what I do for a living. But despite what people think, the one point that I would like to make is that the Jews in the Roman Empire were very different than what we tend to think about them. That's very important to understand. And part of the reason is that Judaism still exists today. I'm not going to ask how many of you are Jews and whatever, I couldn't care, but Jews are still there today, and particularly Jews, and in Christianity, it's the same way. They like to imagine ancient times to fit into the concepts of how they view themselves today. These are, after all, their ancestors and whatever. And the more I study the Jews, I see that there was an entity called Jews. They were called Judaioi in Greek and in Latin later. And they lived all around the Roman Empire. They lived about, I said that the estimates, and these are good estimates, not my studies, but studies that I use, anthropologists and archaeologists. These are good estimates that were about 5 million of them at the peak of the empire, around, say, the 1st and the 2nd century of the Common Era. There were about 10% of the Roman Empire were Jews. About 1/5 of them, that is about 1 million, lived in the area that today we call modern Israel, which was called at the time Judea. It was part of the Roman world. For the most time, it was a province called Judea, with a Roman governor standing. Not all the time, there was, probably you heard of King Herod, which was a local king that the Romans put up. So without going into all the details, about 1 million of them lived in Judea, but 4 million of them lived throughout the Roman world. For example, in the city of Alexandria, the second largest city in the Roman world, second only to Rome, a city of about 500,000 people in the Roman world, about 2/5 of them were Jews. And this is based on very good sources, tax collections and whatnot. So Jews are spread in various ways. And the connection between them is very loose. It wasn't like there was one formula of who is a Jew. They identified themselves as Jews, and by that they embraced certain features, say, of Jewish history. They saw the historical heritage that they're part of this nation and whatnot, and then they accepted certain parameters of life but this was in a very nuanced and in a very diversified way. They celebrated Jewish holidays. They believed in the God of Israel. So it's sort of, they had some problems, say, with Roman gods. Jews didn't go to, for the most part, to Roman temples, for example. But how did all that work? That's part of what I discuss in the book, because it was nuanced, it was varied, it was very complex in terms of the encounter. And it's very different. People tend to say, oh, a Jew was kind of rejecting the Roman way of life. That's, but by essence, this is polytheism and this is monotheism, and Jews are very hostile and against anything Roman. The answer is actually not. And here's the best proof for you right from the book. What represents Roman life more than bathhouses? And every Jew that I know, I haven't found in all my sources, and many Jews are documented, haven't found even one Jew, the greatest of rabbis, it doesn't matter who, all of them went to the bathhouses. And they didn't go to typical Jewish bathhouses where, they would study Torah and worship the God of Israel. No, they went to Roman bathhouses in Roman cities like everyone else, took their clothes off. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand, to accept. So first there is the proof. The proof is in my work. And once you see the proof, the question is, what's the significance of that? And the significance is that I strive to rewrite and retell the story of ancient Judaism, not based on what it is today, but based on what the sources tell us it was in ancient times. So here you have it.
So of course, I mean, there's a lot of questions that are coming up, and I kind of want to encapsulate some of them so I can sort of address as many as possible. But I think first and foremost, people are kind of asking again and again for clarity. Did everyone go to the bathhouses? Like women, slaves, like did they all go together? Did they have separate areas? Were there like certain times of the day when one group would go, or were there different rooms for different people? Or it's just like everyone's in the room together, naked, getting clean?
That's a terrific question. And if I had to answer this question with one word, I would say the word would be varied. If I had to use a sentence, I would say there isn't one formula, there isn't one rule of how bathhouses function, because there was no governing hand to that. It came from underneath. So we find, when we study bathhouses throughout the Roman world, we find the material extremely differentiated and varied. Even in the same place, there were different kinds of bathhouses, there were different operating hours, there were different norms of bathhouses. I'll give you just a few examples to see what you're saying. For example, in certain places in the Roman Empire, we find what's called a bathhouse for women. It's found. There's the terms for it, so we find it in papyri, in Greek, in Aramaic, not that much in Latin, but in references to those houses. So in different places, there were bathhouses. Now, when you say a bathhouse for women, what do you mean by that? So you start to study and you see that there were some places for different, it could be in different reasons. You find them in Egypt, you find them in Syria, you find them among the Jews as well, where bathhouses were devoted only to women. So that something is agreed. The question is not whether those existed, they did exist. The question is whether those were the norms. That's where the historians come, because we have to weigh the evidence. And it's very easy to tell, and I discuss this at length in the book, that even if those existed, there were a fraction, not even a minority, a fraction of the minority. So say, and I did some test cases in certain places, in certain cities, say if there were 60 bathhouses in a given city, which was not far-fetched, and not in the biggest cities, there were more than 60. In Alexandria, there were almost 350 bathhouses. In Alexandria, you find maybe 1 or 2 bathhouses that are called bathhouses for women, and also in certain times. So who went to those bathhouses? Whoever wanted to go to those bathhouses, but not the vast majority, not everyone. And this is just one example. There were other bathhouses. Similarly, in terms of the habits that were going in the bathhouses, did everyone sit? On the whole, the vast majority of people bathed in the bathhouse together. men and women. The slaves would provide services. They would watch the clothing. Thievery was going on there. So you put a slave next to your clothes when you took them off. Others would bring other elements to whoever. Slaves were allowed to bathe as well, but not with everyone else. There were other things that slaves have done. Sometimes they had to protect them. There's no police in the bathhouse. So someone sends a hand or someone sends a punch. It was a pretty violent place. It was also a pretty promiscuous place and whatnot. So slaves also provided kind of protection to their owners for things that they didn't want to do and whatnot. But on the whole, people were there together. And the interesting thing is rich and poor rubbing shoulders. There weren't particular bathhouses to the wealthy like we would expect today. Who would go into a bathhouse and see a billionaire? Last time I saw Steve Jobs in my own, was never, right? But in ancient times, actually, the wealthy wanted to go to the bathhouse with the people, which is kind of fascinating because it was sort of a performative thing. They were able to show that they're coming with a huge quantity of slaves and making headway and whatnot. But at the end of the day, senators and wealthy and lower class people were rubbing shoulders. Sometimes even the emperor went to those bathhouses. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't bathing structures. If I was a multimillionaire and I can have the city send a pipe of water into my mansion, it didn't always happen. But you could we find small bathing facilities in mansions, but those are not the public bathhouses. And even those people, they didn't restrict themselves there. Actually, the sources tell us the wealthy went with the masses. So it's a fascinating social arena where everyone is there together. And there's a lot to study there about that as well.
I'm very fortunate that I was just spending some time in Tivoli and I went to Hadrian's Villa, which had both a small bathhouse and a large bathhouse.
Right.
So you could, Hadrian kind of recamped his whole, he ran the empire from that villa at times. So
exactly. So if you're the emperor, obviously you can do whatever you want. And the emperors had, but not only if you're an emperor, on my side of the street, on the Jewish side, we have the palaces of King Herod in Judea. And in those palaces, he also brought Roman engineers to build him bathhouses as well. So of course you can do that. And of course those existed. But again, if you talk about, say, about 6,000 bathhouses that existed, that's pretty much the number that I reached after a lot of calculating. At one time in the Roman world, there were about 6,000 functioning bathhouses. Out of those, how many were open to the public and how many were restricted? Less than 5% were restricted for various reasons. And we have even, there are different societies, Roman societies, the merchants of wool, they build their own bathhouse in the city of Ephesus. Only the merchants and their families could go in there. They had the money, they had the city on their side. They did that. We have documentation for that. But all those specific bathhouses were less than 5%. 95% of the 6,000 or so bathhouses that you find are public bathhouse opened for everyone. And that says a lot.
Can I ask, well, this is one of the questions, was there a fee to go into the bathhouse? This one's from Teresa. Was it completely free or that?
So I'll take a step back. The two major types of bathhouses that we have, out of those 6,000, about 80% of them fall into one or two categories. One category is bathhouses that were built by the city. A city or a village, whatever it is, the citizens come together, they have city councils, they do a lot of things, they collect taxes and whatnot, they have money. The city feels responsible to build a bathhouse for its citizens. So the city puts together money from what they have, and they hire and builders and architects and whatnot. They build, and that bathhouse is owned by the city. It's owned by the people. That's one type. The second type is a type that, say I'm an individual and I'm a rich man and I have some money and I want to invest. One of the ways to invest is to build a public bathhouse for investment. If I'm a rich person, I can build that bathhouse out of my own money, not out of the city money. I negotiate with the water with the city, so they're able to get the water. I build it, and it's an investment. I collect fees from people who come in. That is minimal fees because most people didn't have a lot. So we find fees in those privately owned public bathhouse. These are not privately owned for private usage. It's a public bathhouse owned in private hands. They do collect fees. They collect also from the vendors. There are a lot of merchants there. A lot of people are selling their services, not only food. Doctors sold their services. Dentists were practicing because they didn't have dental places and whatnot. If you have a problem with your dentist, you go to the bathhouse, you find the dentist, you give him a drachma or whatever it is, and he takes the tooth out, or that happened in the bathhouse. Not only that, a whole range of services were given. That mentioned prostitution and other things that were going on in the bathhouse. The bathhouse owner gets a percentage generates income from the bathhouse. So normally fees would come in those bathhouses. Normally in bathhouses owned by the city, it was part of the service that they gave, and those came in free. Okay, and there were other elements, you needed to go to the bathhouse. One of the things that people loved, for example, is oil, because you smear your body with oil. It functioned a little bit like a soap for us today. You put the oil, and then there's a scraper, a strigil, as we call it, and you scrape the oil out of the body. So many times a bathhouse would come with an endowment that would generate income to buy oil, and anyone who would come to the bathhouse would get a small bottle of oil or get a few drops of oil, as part of what the city gave its citizens. There's a whole variety of activities. It was a living organism, bathhouses, and things changed based on one place to another. But to your question, fees did exist, but not everywhere. Imperial baths, for example, that we find in Rome, were always free. The emperor provided that service to the masses, these great, and everyone who came in, it was a landscape where the emperor can advance and could publicize his greatness and the greatness of his dynasty. So yeah.
It is amazing. I mean, we still have some of these relics that exist throughout the world. And I mean, I've been to some beautiful bathhouses in Hungary, for instance, and in Asia, there's a whole culture for it as well. But I remember going to like an onsen in Japan, and it's very, very specific when you have to take off your clothes, where you have to put them, how you bathe before you get into the water. Like, it's all very ritualized. For the Roman bathhouses, was it very ritualized as well? Was there a very exacting process? How many hours would people expect to spend, or is it very loose and casual to the individual?
Right, and that's related to one of the questions that I saw there. I was hoping that we get to that. Someone asked about the steps and the stages of the bathing process. And I think that's great. And I devote a lot of study to that because Jewish sources actually deal with that. And it's nice to see their impact on the understanding. So the answer is, over time, certain norms and rituals started to develop, mainly because they were very comfortable to follow to the people. And we find throughout the empire, in places as far as Britain and Egypt, people following the same type of rituals. And I'll give you some rituals from different, just two examples, short examples from different realms of bathing culture. One is they developed a certain process of how they bathe. What's the best way to engage the bathhouse? And in their mind, it was, don't jump into the water before you develop sweat. For example, you find that sentence coming up in many of the texts. So they come to the bathhouses, they felt, hey, if I first devote some time to work out or to get kind of sweaty in the outdoors, then start the bathing. But then also, what is the process of bathing? And another rule that they said, don't jump into the hot water, because that was the main thing. So people were running. No, they found out that if you go first into cold water and you clean yourself a little, then you can enjoy the hot water even more. So if you take a look in my bathhouse that you saw there, there's sort of like a circular element that people moved from one room to another. And they started with the cold room. They started immersing themselves in cold water and then go into the hot room and then mediate it. Sometimes either the tipidarium came between the cold and the hot and also came after. So that's a norm of the bathing process that people would go to. And then they would apply oil before they started to clean, but they also like to apply oil at the end of the process. okay, because not to leave the body dry and whatnot. So they had that. There were massages. If you could afford a massage, you pay something. Where bathhouse employees, people offered massages in the bathhouses as well. So that's one of the norms that have found. Let me give you another example from the realm of magic. Bathhouses were also dangerous places, a variety of dangers. I have an entire chapter on the dangers of the bath. It's a fascinating topic. And there were small and large things that could happen in the bath that could harm you, even sometimes just get burned by the hot water or the floors, or slip on the floors. It seems like very nice, but with water, you can slip on the floors, get hurt. There was violence at times. There were no police forces in the bathhouses. There was abuse in the bath. There was rape in the bath. Women, young men, weren't always safe in the bath. There's all sorts of other dangers. And a ritual developed. People in the ancient world felt that magic could help them, protect them from dangers. So you have this ritual of breaking a pottery bowl, a small bowl, as a token of magic to protect you. And you also said like a small formula, a magical formula, that we have it preserved to do that. So many times at the entrance of the bath, you could buy for the smallest amount, a small, very cheap looking bowl, and you'd smash it and you break it. And there was a place to throw it. And archaeologists actually found quantities of these broken bowls in the place. And this was, you do that at the entrance to the bath. So to protect yourself from the dangers that are about to transpire. Okay. So these are just two examples of numerous others of rituals or procedures that started to evolve in engaging the bathhouse.
That's fascinating. I mean, that's something I think that sort of separates our modern bath experiences. Like, the other ones where you're saying about prostitution or massages. Okay, like this is something we can kind of relate to and expect to in these modern era, but magic comes up a little less frequently. But we talked a lot about the bathhouses, and I'd love to get back to sort of the Jewish element, because there's been a lot of questions about that.
Right.
And I'd love to address some of them. One that's come up a few times is with regards to the mikvah, that of course, does the existence of it mean that Jewish women only went at certain times? And did sometimes women use the mikvah instead of the bathhouse?
Right. A fascinating topic, a pretty complex topic that a lot of people don't understand. I found the issues, Jewish rituals are many times conceptualized based on what we understand them today. And when you go to ancient times, they're entirely different. And the mikveh and all the issue of this is related to the topic of bodily purity. The standards, and Jews weren't the only ones to keep their body, wanting for various reasons to have their body at certain times pure. What does that even mean? It's a metaphysical, it's not a scientific thing. It's a metaphysical status of the body. And how does that, and it so happens that Jews, once they encounter impurity, the way to bring the body back to pure is to immerse in water. And the installation that they use is what I call a purifying installation, is called a mikveh. Sometimes people call it, purification bath. And the fact that in English it's called a bath, they tend to start thinking about it bath in the Roman bath. And I found even scholars who talk about a competition between the Jewish bath, which is a mikveh, and the Roman bath. And this is entirely unfounded. I say it with the greatest humbleness on one hand, but with all my work standing behind me, there's no evidence to that whatsoever. The mikveh is not even a bath. You don't go to the mikveh to clean yourself in the ancient world. Actually, many of the mikvehs were extremely dirty because of various laws and whatnot that needed to be applied there. You go to the mikveh for one reason. You immerse your body for a second in the mikveh, and you come out, and it's to transfer your body from the metaphysical status of impure to pure. That's the only reason you do that. And men and women in the ancient world, Jewish men and women could receive impurity in the same way. Today, laws of purity were relegated only to women. Story in of itself, especially in the Middle Ages. But in Roman times, a Jewish man could be impure just as a woman. From what? From ejaculation. Semen was considered an impure element. Now, when you say impure, the equation that we have, in our mind, impure is registered with a sin, with something problematic. And it's not for them. Semen, they didn't see semen as a bad thing. It was just something, one of the major things that creates impurity is a corpse of an animal. So, so you walk in the street of a Roman town, and if you're in the Middle East in the summer, one of the main things on the street in the evening are mosquitoes. And you have a mosquito on your lap, and you killed the mosquito, you're impure. Now, has nothing to do with good or bad. It's just because you came in contact with a corpse, in this case of a mosquito. And what happens? You have to make yourself back pure if you need purity. For most things, you don't even need purity. But in the ancient world, Jews liked to be pure when they prayed, for example. So you go to a mikveh and you get yourself pure. It was just part of the essence of life. And we never find we don't find women not going to places because they're impure. You don't find that, because impurity is right there all the time. And so they found ways to engage in that. One of the fascinating stories is that we find mikvaot in the plural, which is mikvez, one mikveh, numerous mikvaot. We find mikvaot in places where Jewish settlements had bathhouses. And the reason for that is just because of the availability of the water. If there's water coming into that place as well, why do we have to start, going into trouble? Why not provide a mikveh there? But in their mind, in the ancient Jewish mind, that's the important point. And this is, as far as I know, I'm the first one to kind of emphasize that, because it's kind of mixed in the mind of people. And here's the point. The activities that were going on in the mikveh and the activities that were going on in bathhouse, in the Jewish mind, if you're talking to a Jew in ancient times, are entirely different. And the best proof for that is they use two different verbs that are not even related to describe the activity in those two places. In the mikveh, it's the verb that equivalent to the English immersion. You immerse yourself for purity. And in the bathhouse, you bathe for pleasure, not even for cleanness. It's mainly for pleasure. That's how it was. So it was two different activities. They're both associated with water. And because of these misconceptions about hostility of Jews and Roman culture and whatnot, some scholars, some non-scholars, you find it in books quite a lot, even in Wikipedia, unfortunately, you still find that there is sort of a contrast and a conflict between the mikveh and the bathhouse in the mind of Jews. And I discussed this in great detail, and all the documentation is in my book, but the bottom line is that I think it's not founded. I have not found evidence for that. Not only did I not, I found evidence against it, that these were actually two separate activities that could coexist, and in their mind, they're very different.
That's fascinating. I mean, I guess it's similar for the Christian world. Like, a baptism is not having a bath, I mean, there's like one that's sort of a religious activity and one it's a more of a practical daily life. But I want to get to the next question, and there's quite a few, and this is sort of the crux of the whole thing was, and what you've just referenced is, how comfortable were the Romans with the Jews? And I had a few different questions. Some are a little bit more opaque and some are more obvious, but one is, Columbia's Professor Billows teaches that Jews were uncomfortable about being circumcised while non-Jews were not. And so, I think that's, in other words, was it obvious, in this realm, if somebody was Jewish or not, that maybe when you're walking down the street would not have been so obvious?
Right. It's a terrific question, the circumcision question. It's a fascinating question. And I couldn't do justice to it in the conversation right now. And I really invite you to read my in the book, my sub chapter. There's a whole discussion about circumcision. I'll give you the bottom line. The bottom line is that in the Greco-Roman world, it was frowned upon to circumcise. Not because it was a Jewish thing, not because it was a religious thing. It's just because they felt that is a deliberate, you're putting a deliberate harm to your body. And we can't imagine how deep is the cherished of the body and the respect that they have to the human body in Greco and then in Roman culture. So people would not circumcise. And at times, and this is not the norm, they would even create laws against, another group that used to circumcise themselves were priests in temple in Egypt. God knows why, really God. But they did, and sometimes there were rules. They tried to prevent those priests because of that. It wasn't like a religious persecution or anything. What could you do? The Jews were really one of the only, and it's not right to say only. There's some other Arab or what we call proto-Arab groups that also engaged in circumcision in ancient times, like the Edomites and so forth. But Nabateans, some of the Nabateans. But on the vast majority, people were not circumcised. So if you go to the bathhouse, you expose yourself as circumcised right away. And there's so much literature on that, on the Jewish side and on the Roman side. Some of the greatest Roman writers write about experiences that they had when they encountered circumcision in the bathhouse. I'll give you just one example. There are some of these satirical writers, very, very well-known, Juvenal and others that lived in Rome and wrote all these great, people loved their work and whatnot. And one of their scenes is about this guy who comes to the bathhouse and he has something around his loins, which wasn't, it wasn't common. As I said, a lot of people bathed naked, but whatnot, but there were many that were not. And if you look at my reconstruction, some had some clothing to one degree or another. And they poked fun at this guy. Why are you with your loins? What are you afraid of? What are you, what don't you want to show us and whatnot? And then someone kind of stripped the thing out of for him. And the writer says, and you know what we found? And everyone thinks he's going to make up some joke, mean joke about his intimate body parts or whatnot, but he doesn't do that. He says, we found out that he's circumcised. So circumcision was a big thing. And as you said, you're exposed with that. And Jewish sources on the other side also talk about that there is a certain, Jews were at times uncomfortable with their circumcision in the bathhouse. It's very interesting because some of their scholars, those that we call rabbis today, they address that and they play an interesting game with that. We're trying to tell them, what are you talking about? You shouldn't be ashamed of your circumcision. You should be proud of it. Show it everywhere. And they tell it and they give all sorts of, so they play a sort of a game on the issue. So definitely, I would say, not to go too much into detail on this, I would say circumcision was one of the things that stood in the back of the mind of Jews who went into bathhouses. And it's very interesting to see how they reacted to that once they come in with this thing that is, on the one hand, very intimate and very personal, but on the other hand, it's a statement about who you are. And in the bathhouse, it came like that as well. There were, just one more thing I would say. There were Jews who went as far as to, because you get circumcised when you're 8 years old, so no one really asks you. But when you grow up, there were very uncomfortable medical procedures that allowed people to reconstruct, to hide their circumcision. And we have evidence of Jews who went through that process, not one, not two. So you have that because it was an issue. And why do they have to hide it? When are they going to be exposed? Definitely when they went through that medical procedure, the kind of cuts element. Yeah, not enough about that. They did it because they were exposed in the bathhouses. They didn't want that inconvenience to happen. So yeah, and there's much more to it. I wrote about 10 pages on circumcision in the book. It's a fascinating topic.
So this is a moment then when the Jews and the Romans would have, been very separated with regards to just being able to distinguish one from the other. But with regards to their actions, did the Roman Jews simply do as the Romans did in the bathhouses, or did they have different rituals or procedures when they were there? Any other distinguishing features?
Not one answer, some like that, some in another way. We find a spectrum of reactions of how the Jews did. But some of the topics that we've discussed, I can tell you, for example, we talked about magic. People used magic in the bathhouse to protect themselves. Jews used magic in the bathhouse to protect themselves. But at times they said, wow, we can even use magic that would engage the God of Israel. We have one of the greatest gods and all that. So we find magic associated. We find these bowls that I talked about with the name of the God of Israel in Hebrew written on them. So Jews used magic, similar magic activities, but they bring their own thing. Similar, another issue that, for example, many Jews had a problem with is the issue of going to the bathhouse on the Sabbath. On the one hand, it's the most ideal time to go. It's a day that you have free. You can go, the entire family, spend so much time there and whatnot. But warm fire in the Sabbath and the Sabbath don't go together. One of the basic, most elementary rules is that you're not allowed to lit a fire on the Sabbath. And that's why Jews can't make food, hot food, and all sorts of things till this very day. So what do you do with that? And the range of ways that Jewish communities handle that to allow their people to nevertheless attend the bathhouse on the Sabbath is amazing. And I document that in the book. So you do find unique elements to the Jews, but on the overall, I would say the bottom line of my entire book is that the Jews were much more engaged with Romanitas. They were much more Roman together with being Jewish than we tend to think and believe. And it's very easy to understand. We're talking about Roman culture, and Roman way of life was the most dominant culture in the entire Mediterranean world for 700, 800 years. So think about how many generations, how many people came into, this is the way people live. So Jews were Romans, in my view, with some unique aspects. And those unique aspects came into play in different measures and with different strength in different places during the same period of time. So it's a very varied reaction.
Yeah, we just published an article yesterday for our members on Philo of Alexandria. Just you were referencing about the huge Jewish population in Alexandria. And him being a Roman citizen was a very important part of this philosopher's identity, really, even in life. And he's not the only one. I mean, there's quite a few. But I'd love to ask.
Well,
Yeah.
Here we go. Another favorite of mine. Paul's family were citizens, had citizenship. They lived in Turkey, in Southeast Turkey, in Tarsus. But Paul's father was one of the wealthiest people in the family, was in the city, was a merchant, and he acquired Roman citizenship. And that's why Paul, when he was executed, had to be sent to Rome to stand trial, because the rules for Roman citizens were that they can request a trial in the capital by a representative of the emperor. So yeah, many Jews were Roman citizens, and like everyone else, this was an amazing achievement to acquire because of all the benefits that came from it. Being a Roman citizen is much more than being, say, a citizen of, say, an American citizen today. It's much more unique and it's much more powerful.
Yeah, I think Philo of Alexandria, it was his father or grandfather was given citizenship from Julius Caesar himself. So it's quite a big thing. Now, I've got a few other questions I'd love to get to while you're being so generous with your time. One is, what is the relationship with the Greco-Roman associations? I have found in some inscriptions and literature that the associations would meet at the bathhouses, but this has been seen as incidental and not a regular thing. Hearing you speak, I wonder if we should rethink the space of the religious and the other associations, which were very much the backbone of the Greco-Roman world and the bathhouse culture.
Absolutely. The guilds, as we like to call them, associations were so integrated into Roman society. You can't even think about Roman society without having those, because see, people didn't have the associations and the clubs and whatever that we have to get. It was part of their identity. Now, we have two things I would say in relation to the bathhouse. First, some of the wealthy guilds built their own bathhouses that were opened only to the members of their association, because they were powerful and they were wealthy and they had the means to do that. And we find that there. The other thing that we find guild members who weren't able to develop their own bathhouses attending the public bathhouses together. at a certain time, meeting together, because a lot of being a part with an association is a statement of power within society. Sometimes even lower people, if you're able to get yourself into a powerful guild, by the very nature of being associated with that, you're making who you are. So you find the guild members meeting and going to the bathhouse together as a statement of identity and as social power. And that's very interesting. Sometimes you find guilds getting at each other. You know, there were competing guilds on the same issue in one town, two guilds that relate to the same topic, say merchants of olive oil, you know, the guild of olive sellers. You find that throughout Asia Minor all the time. And sometimes there were fights and, you know, and accusations and going on in the bathhouse, and that's documented as well. Other people that went to the bathhouses together, which are not a formal guild, but a type of a guild, were scholars. Scholars, we find the great scholar in Antioch, Libanius, in the 4th century, you know, giving us a lot of information how he and his fellow students, and we find similar things with rabbis. Rabbis like to go to bathhouses together, you know, a whole bunch of rabbis in a group coming together to the bathhouse. So those are sort of statements of social power that transpired in the bathhouse. Although I have to say the most common way to attend the bathhouse was with your family. The father would come from work, everyone would be ready. The wives were many times not allowed to leave the house, even restricted in their ways of going, other than going with the husband to the bathhouse. Husband didn't like their wives going to the bathhouse on their own. Because a lot of things, you know, it was a very promiscuous place. And we have tremendous amount of references to love stories that were going on in the bathhouse. It's even Jewish law and Roman law together all relate to that. What happens with the wife, you know, for the husband, it was never a problem. Different worlds that we live in. But for the wife to find her in some sort of physical activity with someone else in the bathhouse was a problem. So you have families going, you have guilds attending the bathhouse, and you have, you know, was always a major thing in the city, documented also in rabbinic literature and others, when the fighters of the city, you know, the athletes of the city would come to the bathhouse, you know, because one thing was they were kind of physically more attractive than all the others, but they were also kind of local. Everyone is talking, everyone wants to see, everyone wants to touch. Even we have even references to that. So here you have it.
The superstars of the bathhouse. All right, I've only got maybe 2 more questions left because we will have to finish up pretty soon. But this one I thought was very interesting is, was there a difference between bathhouses in Rome and the rest of the empire? And did other groups sort of imitate the Romans in this way?
Right. So the history of the bathhouse, how was the bathhouse developed, is a fascinating topic dealt in the book as well. But in general, I would say the first Roman public bathhouses, and there were styles of other bathing prior to the Romans. I mentioned the Greeks used to bath in these bathtubs and whatnot. The public bathhouse with the hippocaust and the water and all that started in the city of Rome, pretty much in the 1st century before the Common Era. But the great bathhouse, like one of the great huge bathhouses in Rome, was built by Agrippa in the 1st century, who was the best friend of the first emperor Augustus, right? And then it was like a fire in a dry field, you know, right away you find, I don't know what image, you know, you use, but we find bathhouses spread within 30 years. You find bathhouses everywhere in the Roman world. Now, most of them were, that's what's fascinating about it. Architecturally, they looked very similar because every bathhouse had to have water. Every bathhouse had to have this hippocaust. And once you have that and you arrange everything around that, it seems like there is almost like a model, although we don't have a textbook, an ancient textbook that says this is how you build bathhouse. Although the Roman architect writer Vitruvius, who wrote in the 1st century, devotes a chapter to bathhouses, to what to him is the ideal bathhouse. It's not like people read Vitruvius and did their bathhouses. There were just engineers and styles that were going on throughout the Roman world. And you have sort of like a prototype of a bathhouse that then is is copied everywhere. And you find bathhouses in London, in Londonium, the Roman city, and bathhouses in Alexandria looking pretty much the same way. The same visual and architectural language, with certain variations, as you have. Sometimes the statues were different, sometimes other things, but the nucleus seems very similar. And in a way, and that's how culture works. When culture spread out, that's why it's called Roman culture, because you have the same mechanisms of depiction and identity and action carried out in the same way. And then indeed, when you look, one of the interesting things in Jewish sources, when Jews spoke about the bathhouse, they didn't have to identify it with the Romans. They said, we're going to the bathhouse. But no, they call it a Roman bathhouse, which says that in their mind, this specific building was associated with the empire. In Jewish sources, they, for example, engage the question, is it great to have bathhouses? Is it one of the benefits that we have to be part of the Roman world or not? And, like with Jews, on everything, they have like 6 views. So on that topic as well. But to your question, there was a certain common shared apparatus of this institution and structure throughout the Roman world.
Now, I want to finish up with an open-ended question. I thought this was a good one. I haven't ever had anyone ask this question before, but I think it's very, well, I'll just ask it. What questions remain for future research?
Hey, it's a terrific question. On bathhouses, there's a whole bunch of them. Because of the limitation of my work, because I had to finish the work. And so I deliberately left some questions out of my own research. I just said, I can't have the time. I'm never going to finish this. And it's never going to be published in one book. And I'll give you a few examples. For example, the issue of a central issue to the bathhouse, which I mentioned, but I've never studied yet, and it probably warrants an entire book, is the issue of health in the bathhouse. The whole issue, the concept of health. We're so today devoted to our personal health and whatnot. We put so much effort in studying and all the industry that is around that. And a lot of that was in ancient times, the bathhouse was seen as a healthy place. But what is behind that, and how does that manifest itself, and how doctors worked, all the issue of health, the bathhouse as a health institution is something that I haven't studied. And I know there's tremendous amount of material, and some of the great doctors from Roman times devoted chapters and chapters about this, and I didn't work on it. One topic. A second topic that I also didn't work enough on, I'm aware of it, but didn't have time to research, is the economics of the bath. If someone's coming from the realm of economical studies, how much did it cost to make a bath? How did you raise the money? How did you maintain it? How did you keep it going? What kind of economic impact did bathhouses have on cities, on other merchants? How did that play into the ancient world and whatnot? The bathhouse as part of market life or of economic life in Roman cities and in the Roman Empire. Again, there's materials that come into that. Where do they get all the materials? They're the workers, the people who were the experts on building bathhouses. Did they move from one city to another? How did that work? The maintenance of the bathhouse, tremendous topic. Someone who studies that needs to know his epigraphy very well, because inscriptions, most of the inscriptions related to bathhouses relate to maintenance issues in the bathhouse. How did that work, and how did the economy of the bath? Here are 2 examples, and there are more. If someone wants a topic, I'd be more than happy to send them into others. It's a email away. But there's definitely still things to study. Not to mention that I worked on Jews, and in 3 weeks I'm going to be in Oxford talking in a conference about the next stage of the work, which is Christians. I relate to Christianity a lot in the book, but there's not a full study. There's actually one study in German that was written in 1975, but they knew so little about bathhouses then, that there is a place to write, like I wrote A Jew in the Roman Bathhouse, Christianity and Roman Bathhouse is a topic for a few books, and whatnot. So there's still plenty of stuff to do.
Well, I just think this is absolutely fascinating. And, when we were initially speaking, we were saying it's interesting because the world of bathhouses, of public bathing and pools and stuff really does exist, throughout the world still. And in some ways, it's only in the US and some of the Western cultures that it has disappeared. And so it is this very important part of history and culture that I think we have lost to our detriment. That if anything, I think we should bring back the bathhouses. I think it would, body positivity, social cohesion. We live in these sort of isolated worlds. I think it's time for us to get
All right,
to
so here's the story, half joke for you. So I've been at the University of Michigan for 20 years. On my first or second year, a few of our professors, we came up and we talked about all sorts of things and whatnot. We talked about bathhouses as well. We said, how about we go to the university administration? The university at the time that we're trying to, this is 20 years ago, we're trying to bring more people to work out in the gyms and the activity and all that. And we said, how about we open a gym Greco-Roman style, in the gymnasium, which is a Greek word, gymnasium. They used to work out fully nude, so let's bring a gym style, Greco-Roman gym. And the administration said, maybe go to another university, maybe Ohio State or something, but it's not going to happen in Ann Arbor. So we have our constraints, and obviously I'm saying that with a wink. It's sort of a half a joke, but we have our constraints in our world today, much of it because of Christianity, in my view. Christianity brought another set of ideas that took over the Middle Ages, and we're a product of that. That we look at the body, at the human body, and some of the, for good or for bad, I'm not saying that Romans were better, but it's just a fact. We're kind of different. We're in a different place on this trajectory of actions. But it's definitely, if you open a Roman bath, I'm going to be one of the first ones to make sure to let me know. I'll come and see.
Well, thank you again, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you to our wonderful audience for your excellent questions. And please check out the book. I mean, I found it really, really interesting and compelling, and it is this element of the ancient world that we know exists, but we don't spend enough time thinking about it. But when we do, it really is sort of like a window into really understanding the ancients. So thank you again so much for your time, and I hope everybody has a lovely, lovely evening.
Hey, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for attending. It was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I'm just a little bit sorry that I didn't get to read all the chats. A lot of people wrote a lot of good stuff out there and whatever we could, but the discussion could continue. You find my email, and I'm always happy to engage with these topics with anyone. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right.